The first talk is going to be from Kenji Doya, who's from the OIST, Okinawa Institute for Science and Technology in Okinawa, Japan. So thank you very much for coming all this way to speak with us. And the title of his talk is Neural Circuits for Reinforcement Learning and Mental Stimulation.
Okay, so
I'm sorry.
Good afternoon, and thank you for your introduction, and yeah, thank you for coming back. So I very much appreciate this opportunity to join this wonderful conference. So today, I will first briefly talk about where I am from. There has been a lot of discussions about like a divergence and convergence of AI and neuroscience, and then I think for this relatively young audience, talking about how I myself went back and forth between like machine learning and neuroscience might also be interesting. So then I will talk about the reinforcement learning and also the topic of mental simulation, and finally a little bit about patience and serotonin to connect to Zach's talk next. Okay, so I'm from Okinawa, and do you know where it is Okinawa? So this is in the middle of the ocean, southwest of Japan. It takes a 2.5 hours flight from Tokyo, but actually it's closer from many other places in Asia. So here we are starting a new graduate university and then trying to invite students and faculty from Asia and from around the world. And actually last month we had the first graduation ceremony to produce our own PhD PhDs. And then we try to be very kind of interdisciplinary, linking between many different fields, and actually have recruited faculties in those areas. And the topic, the important feature is that there's no departmental structure. So there's one graduate school, and the people working in different fields can freely interact and start joint work. Right. Okay. And then, so my own journey. This is my kind of undergraduate project. This is a time when the personal computers became available undergraduate students, and then I wanted to do something that moves, and not only move but learn to move. Right. So by using a kind of algorithm which is now known as like a policy gradient. So I could let this robot to find out different kinds of motion behaviors, right? At that time, I didn't know the word reinforcement learning yet, but it was quite a fun project using a PC whose clock was still measured in kilohertz. Right? Okay, and then came the kind of connectionist boom, and then I thought about how to make a motor pattern by a neural network. And then the recurrent network with symmetric connections converges to a fixed point, like yesterday you heard from David. But making them asymmetric, it can produce complex behaviors like a limit cycle. And then utilizing architecture today known as something like a reservoir computing or a force algorithm. So I could train the network to oscillate, and then combine it with kind of a reinforcement learning to produce like a locomotion patterns. And then after working on those topics, I became more and more interested in real biological neural networks. So as soon as I get my PhD, I flew to San Diego and then joined the Lobster stratigraphic ganglion lab, which you heard from from the first evening. Right? So I applied, I consider the kind of a Hodgkin-Huxley neural model as a kind of a multi-layer network, and then applied a gradient descent algorithm to fit the parameters who are given a time course of electrophysiology observation. Right? And also used something kind of a dynamic autoencoder to come up with a low-dimension model of a complex neural model to analyze its dynamics. Right. And then went across the street to the SOC and then joined Terry's lab and worked on how the birds learn songs in collaboration with the people at the Mark Konishi lab at Caltech. And based on all the anatomy and the physiology data available at that time, I could produce a kind of reinforcement learning model to reproduce song patterns. And at that time, I could meet with Peter Doya and Reid Montague. So I was exposed to a modern theory of reinforcement learning and also the important role of dopamine. And then back in Japan, I started work on robotics with reinforcement learning. And then you made a robot like this to learn to stand up by like a reward signal given by the height of the head and also punishment when it falls. So after hundreds of bump and falls, this robot could learn this kind of behavior nicely. But behind that, so we have to do a lot of things, like designing the reward function or tuning the parameters, like a learning rate or temporal discounting. So that kind of experience in doing a robotic experiments gave us a lot of new questions to be addressed. So, for example, two other problem of how to design the reward function. So we created a kind of colony of robots which can survive by capturing batteries and then reproduce by software by copying the programs between each other. And then utilizing a kind of embodied evolution framework, we could verify that the robots colony themselves find the right reward function. So that was quite interesting projects. And also we became more and more interested in how the reinforcement learning is realized in the rat brain or human brain. So, and based on the different physical findings, most notably the Wolfram Schultz finding that dopamine neurons encode temporal difference error, and also the cortical striatal synapse has a dopamine-dependent synaptic plasticity. So we came up with the hypothesis that maybe the neurons in the striatum would learn important function for the reinforcement learning, like a state value function or action value function. Yeah, I forgot to insert this slide. Yeah, so in reinforcement learning, so we predict the future reward as a kind of state value function, V of S, and the action value function, Q of S and A. And then use this action value function to select the action, either deterministically or stochastically using, for example, by Boltzmann selection, and also update your value of the state and action based on the temporal difference error. And then, so how to implement these steps and how to tune these parameters, like a gamma for temporal discounting and beta for exploration, alpha for memory update. They are very important problem, both in engineering and I think also in neuroscience. Okay. So to test the hypothesis that the neurons in the striatum would encode the action value function and the state value function, we started the rat experiments. When I moved to Okinawa 14 years ago, I had the opportunity to start my own rat rodent experiment setup. So it's a very simple binary choice task based on the tone. The rat makes a choice to left or right, and the reward probability, like 10%, 50%, 90%, changes as certain blocks. So the rat has to keep track of those change in the reward probability. And then we fit the animal's behavior to the reinforcement learning model, and they estimate how the time cost of the action value function. And then use this kind of a model predicted pattern action value time course as a kind of a fingerprint to look for the interesting neuron activity. And actually, for example, in this neuron, when the rat was hearing the Q tone, the activity changes across trials like this. So there's quite a good correlation. So these neurons may encode something like action value function. Some of the neurons also related to the value function, but proportion to the sum of the left and right action value function. So maybe they would encode something like action independent state value function. And recently, we started like a neuron type specific activity recording using implanted microscope. And in this case, we expressed the GCAMP selectively in the neurons in the striosome compartment of the striatum, which projects directly to the midbrain dopamine neurons. Right. So and then we could verify that some of the neurons have reward predictive activities when the mouse were given order cue, which allowed them to predict the forthcoming reward amount. Right. So and this kind of result is kind of consistent with the like a reinforcement learning hypothesis of the basal ganglia. So, but the paradigm I have talked so far is so-called model-free reinforcement learning, which Jan showed that how dangerous it is to do in the real world. Right? Okay, so in the model-free reinforcement learning, so we assume no knowledge for the agent, and then agent learn from a simple experience of a state action reward sequence by updating the state value function and action value function. So its computation is very simple, but it usually takes many trials for learning. Right? So in the model-based framework, the agent first acquires internal model of the world, right? By taking a certain action at a certain state, what will be the next state? Or to get the reward, in which state, which action you should take. Right? So if such a knowledge or internal model is available, basically the agent can run internal simulation to come up with the right behavior. And also this state transition model is helpful for estimating the current state in a noisy dynamic environment. So this model-based framework allows like a more flexible learning, but internally it requires a lot of computation. Right? So whether to use a model-free or model-based approach, that is a very interesting topic. And also the brain's possible implementation of this kind of mental simulation, that is a very interesting research topic. So this is just one example of how the model-based reinforcement learning works. This is the smartphone-based robot, which we are using in our lab now. So while this kind of movement, this robot samples the data about how the body responds to the wheel movement and make an internal model. And by using a simulation with the internal model, the robot finds this kind of a nice balancing control policy. Right? So just after like about 10 trials. Right? So this way, having an internal model has a good merit. And then, so model-based control is very standard in control theory, but also in the neuroscience. So mental simulation would be a very important and I think a very promising direction of research. So I would define it as a brain process using an action-dependent state transition model, which could be a kind of deterministic mapping like this, or in more general, action-dependent state transition probability. So if such kind of a dynamic model is available, you can use it for estimation of the present state from the past state and action. So that is helpful for perception and noisy or delayed or occluded sensory input. Right? And you can apply this model to the present state, so for model-based decision making or multi-step action planning. Right? And you can apply such a model to an arbitrary state for a kind of imagination. So that will be a basis for our thinking and also use of the language would be very much dependent on such our capability of imagining the meaning of the words, right? And also this will be helpful for producing a theory of science, right? So this use of action-dependent start transition model is a very important component in intelligent behavior of humans and also for some of the animals, right? And probably it is also related to the like a consciousness, but this is mathematically well defined, so we can use prove its use from the behavior more rigorously, and also the mathematical analysis can be possible, right? So, and then how such a process is implemented in the brain, right? So, regarding the different frameworks of learning in mammalian brain, so I've been advocating the position that the cerebellum is specialized for error-driven supervised learning, and the basal ganglia is specialized for reward-driven reinforcement learning, and the cerebral cortex is like unsupervised representation learning, or more in general, creation of a probabilistic model. Right? So today, first presentation by Jan also talked about the goodness of the unsupervised learning. Actually, so what is unsupervised learning and what is supervised learning is sometimes complicated. So in the supervised learning, we find mapping from X to Y. But if you try to model the joint distribution of X and Y, that can be better termed in unsupervised learning. So there's some sort of kind of ambiguity in this definition. So anyway, so if this is the case, how can we use these machinery for mental simulation, right? Or different type of action selection? So model-free action selection would be implemented in network linking in the cortex, action and the state representation in the cortex, and action value function in the basal ganglia, for example. And model-based action selection is a little bit complex. So you need this forward model to predict the next state, right? So, but this forward model mapping from the previous state and action to the new state could in general be learned by supervised learning. So then if it is acquired in the cerebellum, you can think of this kind of scenario. For a current sensory state, some part of brain come up with a candidate, and then the forward model predicts its resulting state, and then the basal ganglia evaluates how good it is, and if it's good enough, try it, and if not, come up with another action candidate. So this is a bit complicated, but once you figure out that this is the right action to take in a certain state, probably you don't want to repeat the same computation again and again. You want to just memorize it. So this is another kind of supervised learning. So some other part of the cerebellum would simply memorize the state action mapping. Right? So that was a kind of idea, and then recently I could convince my graduate student to do a functional MRI experiment and then write a paper about that. And this is a kind of a computer game, which is we call the kind of grid sailing. So it's a grid world task, but to make the game interesting, we limited the movement of the cursor in 3 of the 8 neighbors. So for some direction, you need to do some kind of zigzag movement, like you do in sailing when you go upwind. Right? So and then we let the subject to pre-practice this use of the keypad to move the cursors, and then gave some time before actually starting fingers to plan ahead what is the right path to reach the goal. And during such, from a behavior, we verified that the subjects actually took a benefit by the use of mental simulation using a pre-learned internal model. And during that planning time, areas like the parietal cortex, premotor cortex, and dorsolateral prefrontal cortex were activated. But it was not only the cortical areas. Some part of the cerebellum, shown in blue here, and also anterior part of the striatum were also activated in this planning phase. So this is kind of consistent with our expectation that the network linking a kind of a working memory in the cortex and the forward model in the cerebellum and the evaluation mechanism in the basal ganglia would be used for kind of a action planning by mental simulation. But it exactly prove that this is used for forward model. Maybe we have to do some more experiments. For example, the decoding study. Right? But another important question is what is actually happening in the cortical circuit, for example, during mental simulation. Right? So because these days the advanced technology like a two-photon imaging that you heard yesterday from Dr. Tank is available. So addressing the neuronal mechanism for mental simulation may not be impossible using those technology. So and then how to witness the progress of a mental simulation. So, and this action-dependent state transition model can be used in different situations. One is the action planning. For example, computing action value based on the forward model and the state value function of the next state. Or it can be done in multiple steps. But one difficulty is that it is not very trivial to estimate what kind of action the subject was imagining in a particular moment. So another way of use of the action-dependent transition model is in the dynamic Bayesian filtering. Right? So based on the prior belief about what state you are in, you use the action-dependent state transition model to estimate the current state, and then combine this prior with the likelihood for the current sensory observation to update the posterior. So in this case, the input to the state transition model is the state where you are in and the action you have taken. So it may be easier to detect by experiment. So that's why we came up with this kind of experimental setup together with Aki Funamizu, who is now a postdoc at Cold Spring Harbor, and Bernd-kun, who came from Princeton to OIST several years ago. Right? And this is a two-photon microscope. Under that, we fix the head of the mouse. And then as he walks on this air-floated ball, we gave auditory feedback. So initially, the sound is very small from the front speaker, and as he moves ahead, this shifts to the side speaker with larger sound. So it kind of simulates the like a locomotion in a linear track. And when he cuts the goal line, he is given a sugar water reward. Right? And then to control the sensory feedback, so we created a condition in which the sound's feedback is omitted in those white segments. Right? So this is similar to the kind of popular beach game. So you don't see the target directly, but based on how many steps you have made, and for the intermittent sound, you can estimate the goal position and get the reward. Right? And this is the kind of behavioral data. So as the mouse came close to the goal line, he kind of spontaneously started the anticipatory licking of the sugar water port. And this licking increased almost exponentially toward the target. Right? And the important point is that even when we shut off the auditory feedback, this anticipatory licking still increased. So this suggests that the animal does not only depend on the immediate sound input, but also the based on his locomotion can update the estimate of the target distance, which will result in this kind of increase in the anticipatory licking. Right? And furthermore, when we injected Mushimo to the posterior parietal cortex of the mice, so his behavior was okay for the sound with sound feedback, but when the sound feedback was omitted, this anticipatory licking stopped to increase. So this suggests that the posterior parietal cortex takes an important role in action-dependent update of the internal belief state for the goal distance. Right? So, and then with this two-photon microscope, we could record, observe the activities of parietal cortical neurons, usually like several hundred, and also adjacent higher auditory multisensory area. Sorry, so the big noise. And this is a kind of a summary of recording of several thousand neurons each from the layer 2, layer 3, and layer 5 of the posterior parietal cortical neurons. Right? So, and some of the neurons have a kind of a distance tuning toward the goal, and some of the neurons have a kind of monotonic increase toward the goal, and some of the neurons show the activity in the reward phase. Right? So, and this kind of neurons showing the distance tuning can be used for the decoding of a goal distance. Right? So we took the a population probabilistic population coding scheme kind of proposed by the Alex Puget's group, and then estimate, first identify the distance tuning of each neuron, and then from the instantaneous activity of a neuron, so by combining the likelihood, so we could come up with the posterior distribution of the distance coded by the population of neurons. Right? And yeah, so this is the an animation. This is the actual distance, and this is how this posterior probability follows the actual distance. Right? Right. So, and the important thing is that even when the sound was omitted, so this posterior distribution shifted to the right, representing the approach to the target. And when the sound was turned on, this distribution became sharper. So this is quite similar to what you expect for dynamic Bayesian inference. This is a plot of the peak of the distribution for the posterior parietal cortex and area PM for layer 2, layer 3, layer 5. So we initially hoped that we can see a clear difference for the processing of different layers, different cortex. But amazingly, the behavior is quite similar, almost perfect for any condition. But when we compare the kind of width of the posterior distribution, so we could see kind of a clear drop when the sound is presented. So such behavior is most pronounced in a deeper layer of the posterior parietal cortex. Right? So to summarize, so we could, in the auditory virtual navigation task, from the licking behavior, we showed that mice were not just running, use an internal model to update the estimate of the goal position. And with the two-photon imaging, so the update of the distance representation based on the action, and also its correction using the sensory input, something similar to dynamic Bayesian inference was verified. And in this experiment, we measured the activities of the cortical neurons in layer by layer. So we could not get the dynamic information about how different layers of neurons interact with each other. So figuring out such a dynamics mechanism for implementing dynamic Bayesian inference, that will be a very important topic in the next stage. Right? And we make the data of this experiment available. Some sample data is already available from our web page. So if you are interested in further analyzing the data, please let me know. And in this canonical computing conference, we have heard relatively little about the so-called canonical neural circuit. So just in the previous talk, Dr. Ullman mentioned it. But there's a kind of a stereotyped, there's certain variation, but the common features in the cortical circuit and sensory cortex and the frontal cortex. And in the control literature, the duality of state estimation and optimal control was known for a long time, since the time of Kalman. And recently, the Emo Todorov is advocating different ways of the duality. And then interesting possibility is that the sensory cortex and motor cortex, frontal motor cortex, may implement those dual computation for state estimation and optimal control. Right. Okay, so can I have 2 minutes? 1 minute.
You're
okay.
out of time.
All right. Okay, so then another important topic we have been working on is the kind of neuromodulation. So one type of meta-learning is tuning these parameters for learning. And we specifically advocated that the serotonin was involved in the temporal discounting. Right? So, with the chemical measurement and manipulation, our observation was very consistent with this hypothesis. But actually, with the neural recording, we found that the serotonin neurons are more dynamic than we anticipated. And recently, using optogenetic experiment, we found that the animal becomes patient for the delayed reward. And that is also dependent on the probabilistic structure of the timing of reward delivery. So to explain that kind of behavior, we now working on a Bayesian model of a weighting decision. And then I don't have time to talk about detail, but in this model, if you assume that the serotonin increase the strength of the role of the prior as opposed to the likelihood that we could somehow kind of reproduce the effect of serotonin. Okay, so thank you for your attention and patience. Okay, so this is the end of my talk. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the talk and also for the historical perspective. That was really interesting and also I think really helpful for trainees in the audience to hear about your trajectory. So thank you very much. And we do have time for a few questions. So I had a question about your PPC measurements.
Yeah.
Did you look for any evidence for sensory-driven responses as well? Did the auditory stimulus lead to any sensory responses in the neurons?
Yeah, some of the neurons had direct response to the sound itself. But we done kind of the regression study to see which features each neuron responds the most. And then large part of the neurons were coding the distance rather than just the sound, for example, like a sound intensity.
I see. And one other question too, roughly how many neurons did you need to include in your decoder to get sort of really good performance?
Yeah, so several tens of neurons were necessary. Yeah.
Hi. Similar question to what I've asked you before, but you have these sort of beautiful modeling ideas about a hierarchy of timescales for learning in the basal ganglia. I wonder whether you think that's also reflected in some kind of gradient in the posterior parietal cortex as well as other parts of the cortex like prefrontal hierarchies or even along the long axis of the hippocampus. There's different learning rates for different time scales.
Yes, I think that is possible. And also in the model-based framework, so how many steps you would kind of predict is also important parameters, right? So different cortical areas may be involved in both the time scale and the number of kind of steps of kind of prediction. But I don't have a data for that.
Gonzalo?
Very nice talk. I was wondering, so you mentioned that the serotonin, very briefly, you mentioned that serotonin might have a role in giving more value to the priors. And I was wondering, so depending on where the Raffer project, where do you think those priors are being represented?
The dorsal Raffer nucleus receives input from a variety of areas, including the medial prefrontal cortex. Those areas may compute the whether we should rely on prior more or current input more, but we don't know exactly how these serotonin neurons are controlled, and that will be the topic we will be working on in the next step.
Any other questions? Okay, oh, one more.
When you listed different neuromodulators and which parameters in reinforcement learning they could be fulfilling, I think serotonin was associated right there. The next slide, I think serotonin was associated with temporal discount.
Yeah.
But some formulations of reinforcement learning do not require temporal discount, and for example, if you're learning changes relative to average reward rate, you wouldn't need a discount, and that tends to describe behavior well, like in foraging situations. I'm just wondering, like in a foraging situation in which behavior is well described by a average reward rate formulation, what would serotonin be doing in that case?
Yes, so in this hypothesis, the higher serotonin is related to the flat discounting. So the gamma equal 1 or average reward is associated with a high serotonin level. But this is consistent with some of the observation about serotonin, but as you will hear from Zach, so the role of serotonin is, as we study more and more complex, and probably this captures only one part of the function of the serotonin.
Okay, great. Let's thank our speaker again.
Thank you.